Russia, a land of vast forests, icy plains, and bustling cities. In the early 1900s, it was ruled by a powerful emperor called the Tsar. The Tsar, Nicholas II, held absolute power. He lived a life of luxury, far removed from the everyday struggles of his people. Life for ordinary Russians was tough. Most were peasants, toiling on land they didn't own. They faced poverty, hunger, and disease. The cities were growing, but factory workers endured terrible conditions. They worked long hours for low wages. Russia seemed like a giant about to wake up. Beneath the surface, anger and resentment simmered. The people yearned for change. They yearned for a better life. They yearned for a voice. Little did they know a storm was brewing, a revolution that would change Russia forever. Tsar Nicholas II believed in autocracy. This meant he had all the power, and his people had no say in how they were ruled. He was a devoutly religious man, but many saw him as out of touch and uncaring about their plight. The Tsar's government was inefficient and corrupt. Officials often cared more about enriching themselves than serving the people. Opposition to the Tsar grew. People from different walks of life, students, intellectuals, factory workers, began to demand change. Some wanted a constitutional monarchy. This would limit the Tsar's power and give more rights to the people. Others wanted to overthrow the Tsar altogether and create a socialist society. The stage was set for a clash between the old order and the forces demanding change. The Tsar's days were numbered. Russia was a land of stark contrasts. A small group of nobles and wealthy merchants lived in luxury. They enjoyed lavish balls, fine dining, and opulent palaces. They seemed indifferent to the plight of their countrymen. Meanwhile, millions of peasants struggled to survive. They lived in poverty, often on the brink of starvation. Their lives were a constant struggle for basic necessities. In the cities, factory workers toiled in dangerous conditions. They earned meager wages and had few rights. The gap between rich and poor grew wider. Resentment towards the wealthy and the Tsarist regime festered. This inequality created a breeding ground for revolutionary ideas. The people were ready for change, even if it meant resorting to violence. In 1914, World War I erupted across Europe. Russia, allied with Britain and France, joined the fight. The war proved disastrous for Russia. Its army, ill-equipped and poorly led, suffered heavy losses. Millions of soldiers died, and the economy crumbled. The war exposed the Tsar's weaknesses. He took personal command of the army, a decision that proved disastrous. His wife, Tsarina Alexandra, was left in charge of the government. She was influenced by the mystic Rasputin, a controversial figure who further eroded public trust. Food shortages and inflation became rampant. People lost faith in the Tsar's ability to lead. The war, meant to unite the nation, had the opposite effect. It pushed Russia to the brink of collapse. The time for revolution was ripe. Section 5, February Revolution, the Tsar steps down. By 1917, Russia was a powder keg ready to explode. In February, or March according to the modern calendar, a series of strikes and protests erupted in Petrograd, the capital city. Workers demanded bread, peace, and an end to the Tsar's rule. The Tsar, out of touch and unable to grasp the severity of the situation, ordered the army to quell the unrest. However, the soldiers, many of whom sympathized with the protesters, refused to fire on their own people. Instead, they joined the revolution. The Tsar, abandoned by his troops and facing overwhelming opposition, was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries, came to an abrupt end. The February Revolution, as it came to be known, had toppled the Tsar, but it was only the beginning. Section 6, a time of uncertainty, the provisional government. With the Tsar gone, a provisional government took control of Russia. It was made up of liberal politicians who wanted to establish a democratic government. However, the provisional government faced enormous challenges. Russia was still at war, the economy was in shambles, and the people were demanding radical change. The provisional government made the fateful decision to continue fighting in World War I. This proved deeply unpopular with the war-weary population. Meanwhile, another group was gaining power, the Soviets. These were councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants. The most influential Soviet was the Petrograd Soviet, led by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. The Soviets had a strong influence on the people and challenged the authority of the provisional government. Russia now had two centers of power, the weak provisional government and the increasingly powerful Soviets. This situation of dual power could not last. Section 7. Lenin's return. A new leader emerges. In April 1917, a momentous event occurred. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party, returned to Russia from exile. The Bolsheviks were a radical socialist group that believed in seizing power through a revolution. Lenin, a brilliant strategist and ruthless revolutionary, immediately saw an opportunity. He rallied his supporters with the slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread." This message resonated with the war-weary, land-hungry, and starving masses. Lenin argued that the provisional government was incapable of solving Russia's problems. He called for the Soviets to seize power and establish a socialist state. His return marked a turning point in the revolution. The Bolsheviks, once a fringe group, were now poised to play a leading role. Section 8. The October Revolution. The Bolsheviks take control. Under Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks gained control of the Petrograd Soviet. They planned to overthrow the provisional government. In October or November, according to the modern calendar, they made their move. The Bolsheviks, led by Leon Trotsky, launched a nearly bloodless coup. They seized key government buildings, communication centers, and the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. The provisional government, weak and unpopular, offered little resistance. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in control of Russia. They wasted no time in implementing their radical agenda. They ended Russia's involvement in World War I, nationalized land, and gave factories to the workers. Section 9. The Russian Civil War, a fight for the future. The Bolshevik seizure of power sparked a brutal civil war. Anti-Bolshevik forces, known as the Whites, rose up against the Red Army of the Bolsheviks. The Whites represented a diverse coalition: monarchists, liberals, socialists who opposed the Bolsheviks, and foreign powers who feared the spread of communism. The Civil War raged for 3 years, from 1918 to 1921. It was a complex and bloody conflict, with atrocities committed on both sides. The Red Army, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, proved to be a formidable force. They were highly motivated and benefited from strong leadership, particularly from Leon Trotsky, who organized and commanded the Red Army. The Bolsheviks also controlled the key cities and industrial centers, giving them a strategic advantage. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had emerged victorious. They had defeated their enemies and consolidated their hold on power. Section 10. The Rise of the Soviet Union. A new era begins. In 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union, was established. It was a vast empire encompassing much of the former Russian Empire. The Bolsheviks, now known as the Communist Party, were the sole ruling party. Lenin and his comrades set about building a socialist state. They implemented radical economic and social reforms. They abolished private property, collectivized agriculture, and nationalized industries. They also introduced a new constitution that gave all power to the Soviets. Lenin envisioned a world revolution, where workers in every country would rise up and overthrow their capitalist oppressors. However, his health deteriorated, and he died in 1924. A power struggle ensued among his lieutenants, with Joseph Stalin eventually emerging as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Section 11. Conclusion. The Revolution's Long Shadow. The Russian Revolution was a pivotal event in world history. It marked the end of centuries of Tsarist rule and the birth of the world's first communist state. The revolution had a profound impact on Russia and the world. It led to the rise of the Soviet Union as a major world power and sparked the global spread of communist ideology. The revolution also had a lasting impact on social, political, and economic thought. It inspired revolutionary movements and influenced political systems around the world. The legacy of the Russian Revolution remains complex and contested. It was a time of great upheaval, violence, and suffering. But it was also a time of hope, idealism, and radical social transformation. The events of 1917 continue to shape our understanding of revolution, ideology, and the nature of power.